Peace. Um, I wanted to make a video blog and talk about Gothic subculture and why I've been into it for so many years and what I love about it and the beauty of it. And this is my story of finding my way through this beautiful subculture and why I've been loyal to it for so many years. I mean, I would love to hear everyone's story of how they first found Gothic subculture and why it inspired them and why they're loyal to it. And I'm sure I will hear a lot of interesting stories. But this is my story. Okay, I think one of the reasons that draw me to the Gothic subculture is actually my upbringing of being a Catholic, because there's nothing more Gothic than Catholics. I mean, the imagery, just everything about it is very dark, it's very gloomy, it's very full on. And so I think that that's one part of it with my Catholic upbringing. I remember when I was a kid, I found so much solace in those very gloomy, dark stories of being Catholic, growing up Catholic, and all these stories I heard from the monks and the nuns and everything. And it just put that image of not only darkness, but also the image of light encased in the darkness. And later on, when I became Gothic, I realized that that went hand in hand, the darkness with the light, the two faces, different faces of the same coin. I learned that later on, and that's one of the things that people in the subculture, the Gothic subculture, don't tell you about the beautiful light just within most Gothic people. It shines, but outwardly they have this dark shell, this dark, aesthetic, if you will, for lack of a better word, and that you find very much in Catholicism. And growing up Catholic, when I fell in love, I always loved being Catholic. I transferred that into what became the Gothic subculture for me and stuff and everything. So I know that's one aspect of it. Just like the crucifix, I remember I always loved the crucifix. I always loved wearing the rosary. I always liked being like this, having the sensibility of this forlorn state where I'm by myself, I'm alone, but I have to seek out this God that's outside of me. And I think that in a lot of ways, Gothic people is like that. Like they're like these people that are alone in their own mind and their own brain, but they have to seek out like the subculture in order to be part of the community and stuff. Like it's kind of like very similar, the ideologies of both and stuff. But when I was a kid, and this is talking about the aesthetic wise of it, the goth music, the clothes, and so on and so. I remember how when I fell in love with that, was via a lot of different situations via a lot of different things that I learned in my life in order to bring me to that point and so. But I remember like when I was like 13, 12, 13, 14, I was a break dancer and I had a huge following of people that follow me because I was a pretty popular break dancer in New York and the Bronx back in the days. And I became a new waver. And back in the days, if you were a new waver and you were Puerto Rican, you lived in New York City, you could get killed. It was real dangerous back in the days and so. But I didn't care. I became a new waver. And at first, a lot of people made fun of me and they didn't get it and they thought I was gay and all this stuff and everything. But little by little, a lot of my friends started following me and they started listening to like the music. I was really into The Cure when The Cure first came out, late 70s, early 80s, and like Bauhaus and like, all those bands and Psychedelic Furs. And so I was into all these bands and everything, and I would introduce it to my friends, and we all became post punk new wavers. But new wave is very different than it's very connected to the goth soul culture, but it's very different because it comes from an earlier culture, subculture called the New Romantics from England. That was a thing in the late 70s. And you could see the style of the New Romantic. You type in New Romantics aesthetic, you see the style, you could see the goth style, and also you could see the steampunk style came from that, and also cyberpunk came from that as well. But that was a movement in the 70s, and so New Wave came out of that. And then in New York, I was into like Bowie and all these bands and everything, and I would introduce them to all my friends, and all my friends fell in love with it, and they all became New Wavers. They all shaved their hair, pierced their ears, and we were all these Puerto Rican New Wavers in the early 80s walking around being so New Wave and going to all these New Wave places and dancing and everything. There was this one club, it was a New Wave club in the Bronx called the Devil's Nest, and I would hang out there. And I remember I saw a lot of punk guys hung out there, and I remember seeing the beginning of the goth subculture being in that club because it was kind of like a hybrid as far as aesthetic wise, style wise, a hybrid. But it was a famous club called the Devil's Nest. It opened up in the late 70s, early 80s in New York City. But that was a club that I lived right up the block from it, so I used to walk to it. But so I was a new waver, and I would go to all these different. I remember when I was like 15 or 16. I think I was 16 years old, and I had a girlfriend, and she was turning 16, so she was having back then. Puerto Ricans have this thing called Sweet 16. They have it when they're 16. It's kind of like a bar mitzvah for girls for Puerto Ricans, and she was having a Sweet 16, and I was already 16, and I remember I was in at her party, we were eating, dancing, whatever, and everything. And she's like, "Oh, my cousins, they're gonna come. You'll really like them. They into they're new wavers, just like you." I go, "Oh, really?" And she's like, "Yeah, they're gonna come and they're gonna be here at 7 o'clock, whatever." And so when they showed up, these two guys, her cousins, these people were straight up death rockers. God, they weren't new wave at all. They were like death rocks. And I remember, I was like 16 years old, and they just walk in, and the guy had really big hair like that, and black lipstick, and shaved on one side, and pointy shoes, and I remember how we started talking. I was just like, "Oh shit, they look they look like vampires." Because prior to that, I grew up in love with horror movies. I was so obsessed with horror movies. Like I was obsessed with Frank. I'm still obsessed with Frankenstein. Look, it's a Frankenstein right here. So and they have it all over 'em, all different action figures of Frankenstein. But I was obsessed with horror films, and so they looked like something out of a horror movie. And I was like, "What the fuck are these people?" And then we started talking to our cousin, and he's like, "Hey, we're going to Riddler's." And I go, "What's Riddler's?" And they go, "Oh, it's a vampire club." And I was like, "What? A vampire club that exists?" And then they're like, "Yeah, it's a vampire club. You want to come and everything?" And I was like, "Hell yeah!" So I ended up leaving my girlfriend. My girlfriend got really mad. She's like, "You gonna leave?" I go, "Yeah, I want to go to this vampire party and everything." So we end up getting there, and when we got there, these guys tried to beat us up. Like this car tried to hit us, and these guys they were like trying to kill us. These guys in the Bronx, and we took off. And it was really scary. We were in his car, and he had a black car with tinted windows, and we took off. And these people were following us, and we ended up losing them. It was like so crazy. And I was like, "What are these guys that people want to kill them?" Because the new wave people would just call you a faggot, and whatever. And so, but these people really were scared of these people and wanted to kill them. And the guy was driving. He wasn't even scared. I could see his hair and I could see his black lipstick, and he's just driving a car like that. And the people are driving behind us trying to get us. And I'm like terrified. I'm in the back seat, terrified, And I'm like, "God, I wish I didn't leave the party. I wish I would have stood there where I'm hanging out with these vampires." And so we're just driving and driving, and then he's not even afraid. And I'm like, "What is this style that this guy's not afraid?" And everything. And anyhow, so we get to this club, we park the car, we go to walk in. They don't let me in because I'm too young and everything. Back then you had to be 18 or 20. I don't remember the age, but I think I was like, "You're too young, I can't let you in." He didn't let me in, so I stood outside and just watched all the Gothic people going, all the death rockers. And this was like 1980. I don't know, this was like 1983, I think, or something. And I just stood outside watching all these people. And this one guy came out, his name was Henry, and he was a visually beautiful gay person. And I started talking to him, and he's like, "Yeah, I hang out." And at that point, I didn't have any gay friends. And he's like, "Yeah, I've been hanging out. I hang out in this place, the Village." And I knew about the Village because when I was a breakdancer, my manager went and bought a lot of clothes in the Village. So I knew that was a place where all the weird people hung out, all the punk rockers and all the goths and all the new wavers. And I had went down there, to buy clothes and everything. And being a new waver at the time, I would go to all the new wave places and everything. And so he's like, "Yeah, I go to this place and everything. So, to buy clothes and everything." So I went to that place. It was called Unique Boutique. It's a really famous goth store. It'd been gone for years. But I went there and it was all black clothes and all. It became later turned into Religious Sex, which is a really famous bondage store in New York City. But back then it was called Antique Boutique or Unique Boutique or something. I ended up working at that store actually like 2 years later, being a salesperson. But so I went to the store, and I remember like after that I left. He's like, "Yeah, we hang out in Washington Square Park and everything." And so I ended up going down to Washington Square Park, and then I ended up seeing this guy that I used to see in my neighborhood. He used to walk around wearing black lipstick, and he used to wear black. I used to see him, but I didn't really know. I didn't talk to him. Always see him from a distance. I didn't know who he was, but I saw him at that park, and he's like, "Yeah, you live in the Bronx, right? Yeah, I see you all the time." And he lived in my neighborhood, and he was part of this huge gang of Gothic Gothic people. And there was a next to where I lived, but I didn't even know they existed. I didn't even know that they lived around there. But they lived in this neighborhood, and they were all these Puerto Rican Gothic people, and they would just hang out and everything. And the reason why they formed this big gang because they would get beat up all the time, and so when they would get beat up, they just for protection they formed this huge gang, and all their girlfriends turned into, we used to call them Nefertiti's because of the Nefertiti hair that goes to one side, the Susie hair. That was a style called a Nefertiti back in the early '80s, and the Puerto Rican girls were called Nefertitis, but they wore black lipstick and they wore the Susie makeup. A lot of people think that that's originally, Susie, that she invented that style. Nope, that's not true. That style came from the mods, actually from England and from the early mods in New York in the '70s and the beatniks. That's where that style came from. So that was a style that been around for a long time. Susie didn't invent that style. I used to have a girlfriend that had the Nefertiti, Puerto Rican girl that had that style before, even Susie and stuff. But anyhow, so the girls who wear it and the guys who wear black lipstick, and he's just like, yeah, you should come to our neighborhood. You should come hang out with us and everything. And so I went and I started hanging out with that guy and the gay guy Henry, and they became like my best friends. And then I started wearing all black, and then I started, that's what really got me into the aesthetic and everything. And also the thing that was really different about the subculture, the punk subculture and the new wave subculture versus the gothic subculture was there was more community with the gothic subculture. There was more philosophical bent to it, and there was more of a spiritual or religious aspect to it. Like it was really just different type of like sensibility, if you will, for lack of a better word. Whereas the post-punk new wave was more about the individual, was more about a lone wolf, even though you had your community and you had your friends like-minded and you all dressed similar, you were pretty much on your own. But with the gothic subculture, it was more about family. It was more about being connected and people looking out for you and just belonging somewhere, being part of a fold, a flock, and I think that was very appealing to me because I didn't have that with my family. And I found that in the folds of the Gothic subculture. Things change so much. I mean, fast forward 35 years, whatever, 30 years, whatever. It's more like about music. It's more about the aesthetic of fashion, like which is fine. You could be wherever you want. You could even be a weekend warrior, if you will. Long as you're respectful and you're kind to people, and you could be into subculture. It's not inclusive, anymore and everything. But back in the days, it was. It took a lot of sacrifice, And I remember back then, we always, and I can't stress this more than anything, we always saw ourselves as punk. That was that was the blood in our veins. We were punk, and that meant so much in the late '70s, early '80s to be punk. It meant so much. It wasn't what it means now, obviously, so many years later, but back in the days, that's what it was. We were just a subgroup of punk, but we were punk. We were proud of the label punk, And never I would get on the subway, people would call me because people didn't use the word. For one thing, the word goth is a Western term. That was a term that came from the West, from California, the word goth, to shorten the word Gothic. Back in the days, it was always Gothic. It was never goth, Like, I remember the first time I heard that word is when I moved to Colorado. And I remember, so it's like goth. And I'm like, what the hell is that? And they're like, Gothic. I'm like, oh, you mean goth? But you just call it, just say Gothic. Why are you going to call it goth? And I guess it's easier to use that word, but that was a word that was never used in New York City. We always use either death rock, and death rock was something that came from California, so that seeped in a little bit later, and that came via the vampire subculture and so. But we always had the vampire subculture. In New York City, we had the vampire subculture from the 1960s. It'd been around for a long time, and the vampire subculture actually came out of the Wiccan subculture, which was also, a Gothic subculture, but it came out of that subculture, and it became the vampire culture, and then later out of the vampire culture came later steampunk and cyberpunk, and all these other subgroups came out of the vampire subculture, and the bondage subculture came out of that as well and everything. But when you're talking about like the Gothic people that I hung out with, it was more punks, And there was a couple of terms they used to call us back in the days. They used to call us blackies. That's a word that people don't never heard of, but they used to call us blackies because we wore black lipstick, black eyeliner, black fingernail polish. So we were called blackies. We were also called darkies. Those are all terms that people in the Bronx call us, which those terms never became standard terms, the standard for people, meaning the goth subculture and everything. The word that apparently stuck was the word Gothic, which was a term that the manager from Joy Division used in 1979 to describe the music of Joy Division. Hence he used the word Gothic. And also there was a earlier article about Jim Morrison explaining his aesthetic and his style, and they used the word Gothic to refer to Jim Morrison. And then also, but Jim Morrison also he inspired the bondage movement as well, and the Wiccan movement. He inspired that because there was a short period in Jim Morrison's life when he was a Wiccan. Actually, a lot of people don't know that. And also, he wore the leather pants, he wore the bondage belt, and he wore the leather jacket. So he inspired a lot of what later became the cyberpunk scene and everything. But us, in the Bronx, we were punk rockers, we were punks, but we also saw ourselves as spooky punks. That was another term that was heavily emphasized and used to describe us because we were punk and we saw ourselves as punk, and the media saw us as punk, and our peers who weren't in the subculture saw us as punk and everything, but we just had a gloomy bent. Like we wouldn't fight with people and be anarchistic and be rebellious in that way. We were rebellious in another way. Like we were more like embracing the darkness and embracing the cemeteries and all the things that we're afraid of, like death. We embrace like more. I remember people were terrified of cemeteries back in the days, but we would go to the cemetery. We would go to smoke weed. We would go to have sex with our girlfriend. We would go to hang out in the cemetery. Or that was like our second home was the cemetery. And people would be like, I remember my brother who didn't grow up in the Gothic subculture. Why you go to the cemetery? You're insane. And I would be like, it's so peaceful. It's so no the dead people are so passive. They're not gonna ghosts are not gonna haunt you. And a lot of people who are Gothic, they have this supernatural aspect, and that's the thing that's lacking in the Gothic subculture now. Actually, is the supernatural aspect. And also, I want to make another point. A lot of the so-called emos that people hate on, like a lot of goths, they don't like emos. They hate on them. But if you really want to know the truth, the earlier groups of Gothic people like the darkies and the blackies, the people that I was talking about, the early Gothic people in New York City, they would be more associated with emos today than Gothic people. If they were around today, fast forward 40 years in the future, 35 years in the future, they would be more emo than Gothic just because emos are more punk than actually goth. And I think that's taken out of it, that obviously so many years later, Gothic became its own entity and is totally almost void of the origins of punk. If you think about it, it almost rebels against punk, just the sensibility of it today, because it's like a fashion if you will, it's a fashion trendy subculture. We know what it is now. Okay, what it turned into, and a lot of it is devoid of the ugliness of punk. Back in the days, we're like, no, we're punk and everything, and kind of the emos, which I think that subculture died at this point. But that's kind of like when they got into it's more like, yeah, I'm gonna be punk, but I'm gonna be emotional, and I think that's how we were. We were very emotional, we were very dark, we were very gloomy, but we saw ourselves as punk and everything. So I wanted to make that point and everything. But getting back to my original assessment, so that's how I got into like the subculture and everything, and the beauty of it, and the sensibility of it, and what it means like to be like a gothic person. And also like, you think about the music, like there's so much different. I remember like back in the 90s, there was this, or the late 80s, there was this music called ethereal goth, and that spoke to my condition. And it spoke to so many people's condition. But basically, it was this ethereal, beautiful music that was very dark, like Cocktail Twins, and like, all these different bands came out of that, and later that became, indie music and dream pop, and it's all kind of cheesy now and everything. But back in the days, it was called ethereal goth, and I remember how a lot of this came out in the mid '80s, and I remember a lot of Deck and Dance. It wasn't ethereal, but Deck and Dance was kind of like the father or grandparents of that sensibility, if you will, and everything, like being in perspective and being very like philosophical. And that's another thing that's lacking now in the Gothic subculture is the philosophical aspect. like just being a philosopher and psychoanalyzing why, because back in the days we would try to understand why we the way we are. We knew we were social outcasts, we knew that we were disenfranchised, we knew we were marginalized, and we didn't know why. We wanted to know why. And so it was a lot of deep thinking people in the subculture. In this day and age, because of the music subculture, the trendiness of it, that doesn't exist anymore. People just don't really, I wish that came back. I wish people would have these discussions. I remember that was a thing that lasts all the way to the 90s. People, when I first moved out here in 94, I remember I had my little group of Gothic friends in Denver and in Boulder, living in Boulder, but I had my friends at the Rec Room or at Ground Zero. And I remember how I would like congregate with these people, and we would go to the cemetery and we would just talk about philosophy and about poetry, and we would write poems to one another. I love that part of being Gothic, man, just the poetry, and also like just trying to be refined, even though we don't have money and we don't have a good job, but just having the air of that, but portraying that outwardly. Like that's all things of the past. Like people just don't have that. And I guess, a lot of the elder goths, they still have that. They still follow that principle. They still connected to that. But a lot of the new subculture don't pertain to any of that. They don't really care. They don't think it's accessible. That they don't need to do it, which you don't need to do it. You can do whatever you want. You can listen to whatever you want to do. If you don't want to write poetry, fine. So I'm not saying that people should be a certain way if they want to benefit from the subculture. Any is open to everyone, and so. But those are the things that I loved about it. Those are the things that essentially were gothic, if you will, for lack of a better word. And so, but yeah, and if you look at like England, and you look at New York, and you look at Los Angeles, there's so many different versions of Gothic. Like if you look at the Gothic in New York, it really came from Lou Reed, and the Velvet Underground. Really, that's where it really came from, and their phenomenon, their thing came from the New York Beatniks, and the New York Beatniks been around since the 1940s and 50s and stuff, and they were, everyone know who the Beatniks were, but a lot of what later became Gothic came out of that and everything. But if you look at the LA Gothic, the death rock that came straight out of the punks of LA and stuff, and the punk and also punk music. You listen to Christian death, that's punk music basically. They consider death rock. You listen to any death rock music, it's punk music actually. It's just that the people look a little more spooky, like the Misfits, whatever, and that's more psychobilly, but it's all that stuff. But so a lot of the different locales like New York and like Los Angeles, and it depends on the type of music. But if you look at New York City, the Lou Reed, those are more the kind of philosophical thinking. Like with the Los Angeles, it was more about the fighting against the world, anarchists, punk rock, death rock, and Josinistics, or all this kind of warrior mentality. But you look at the New York phenomenon of being Gothic, it was more about the Lou Reed, via the Lou Reed Velvet Underground, and to a lesser extent, even Jim Morrison, even though Jim Morrison is from California, Jim Morrison inspired a lot of Gothic people in New York City in the late 70s after he died in 1975 and stuff. And so, but it was more about like the thinking, and also, even though Hollywood is in California, the cinema phenomenon in New York City was a really big thing. Like people just, because New York is such a harsh city to live in, especially in the 70s and early 80s, that people just was obsessed with movies, and so people would go to see horror movies, and that was such a big thing in New York City. So you have that horror movie phenomenon, and also that's another thing via if you think of like, Bauhaus, when Peter Murphy did his makeup, and also The Dam, when he did his makeup, they wanted to look like Bela Lugosi, they wanted to look like vampires, they wanted to look like people from horror movies, and so that was a big emphasis in England, the horror movie thing. But in New York, I remember every Gothic place was obsessed with horror movies. We just have, that's another thing. When I first moved down here, I would hang out with other Gothic people. We would watch horror movies. We would go over someone's house and watch horror movies, like something like 15 of us. We would just all be sitting there smoking. Like, why? Like, people don't do that anymore. I wish people had done that, but people just don't do that. But that's the thing, me growing up in New York City, that was like a really big thing, the horror movie and everything. And then, I mean, in different locales, there's different things, but yeah. I think I'm out of words, so I think I'm going to end this video blog, but I just wanted to like just talk about, because I would like to hear other people's stories about, oh man, like some people could be like, I saw a video and I fell in love with the video, and that's why I want to be Gothic. I saw a picture of Susie and I want to be. Everyone has a different story and everything, and I think I would like to hear like other people's stories and stuff.